There are crimes that shake us to our core, that make us question how someone could walk among us, smile at neighbors, go to work every day, and harbor such darkness within. The story of Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, is one of those cases that forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look the most ordinary. This isn't just a story about a serial killer. It's a story about the women whose lives were stolen, about a community living in fear, and about how justice, though delayed, eventually arrived through science and determination. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to connect with you. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you at home, maybe late at night, or perhaps listening while you commute? Wherever you are, thank you for being here. If this story resonates with you, if you appreciate the research and respect we're showing to the victims, please hit that like button. It helps more people learn about these important cases and honors the memories of those who were lost. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons born to Thomas and Mary Ridgway, a family that would soon relocate to Seattle, Washington. On the surface, they seemed like any other working-class American family trying to make ends meet. Thomas drove buses for a living, working long hours on routes that took him through every corner of the city. Mary stayed home, raising the boys in a modest house near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, along the Pacific Highway South. That highway, that stretch of road where thousands of cars passed daily, would later become synonymous with terror. But in those early years, it was simply home. Yet inside that home, darkness was already taking root. Mary Ridgway was described by those who knew the family as domineering and harsh. She punished young Gary frequently and severely for minor infractions, creating an atmosphere of fear and resentment. As Gary entered adolescence, something twisted within him. He developed disturbing fantasies about his own mother, a psychological tangle of attraction and rage that would later help experts understand his hatred toward women. He fantasized about killing her, these thoughts growing darker as he grew older. Meanwhile, his father complained constantly about the prostitutes he encountered on his bus routes, calling them degrading names, speaking about them with contempt. Young Gary absorbed these messages, storing them away in the recesses of his mind. School was a struggle for Gary. He was dyslexic, unable to read at the level of his peers, and his IQ tested in the low 80s. He failed grades and was mocked by classmates. The frustration of not being able to learn like others, combined with the abuse at home, created a volatile mixture. At 16 years old, Gary committed an act that should have raised every red flag imaginable. He lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him repeatedly in the liver and ribs. The child survived, and Gary later claimed he wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. The incident was brushed aside, treated as a disturbing anomaly rather than the warning sign it truly was. How different might history have been if someone had recognized the monster being born? After barely graduating high school, Gary joined the United States Army and served during the Vietnam War from 1969 to 1970. He never saw combat, working instead in support roles, but he contracted gonorrhea twice during his service, evidence of his already compulsive sexual behavior. When he returned to Washington, he found work as a truck painter at the Kenworth factory in Renton, a job he would hold for 3 decades. It was stable employment, the kind that makes a man seem responsible and trustworthy. Gary punched in every day, painted trucks, collected his paycheck, and went home. To his co-workers, he was quiet, unremarkable, maybe a bit odd but harmless. They had no idea. Gary married 3 times, each marriage revealing different facets of his fractured personality. His first wife, Claudia Barrows, married him in 1970 when he was just 21. They had a son together, Matthew, but the marriage fell apart within 2 years. Claudia would later speak about Gary's insatiable sexual appetite and his violent temper. His second marriage to Marcia Winslow lasted from 1973 to 1981, ending when she discovered his constant infidelities. Gary was obsessed with sex, demanding it multiple times every single day, even in public places. He was also a regular customer of prostitutes, cruising the Pacific Highway south night after night, seeking out the women he claimed to despise. In 1988, Gary married Judith Mawson, a devout religious woman who believed she had found a good Christian man. Judith described Gary as loving and attentive, a man who read the Bible, attended church services faithfully, and even went door to door preaching the gospel. She trusted him completely. She never suspected that her husband was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Years later, after his arrest, Judith would claim that their marriage had saved lives because Gary truly loved her, and his killing slowed dramatically after they wed. Only 3 confirmed murders occurred after 1988, compared to the more than 40 in the preceding years. It's a chilling thought that love, or something resembling it, might have been the only thing standing between dozens of women and their deaths. But let's be clear about something. Gary Ridgway made choices. Every single time he picked up a vulnerable woman, every time he wrapped his hands around someone's throat, every time he returned to a body to commit unspeakable acts, he chose to do those things. His difficult childhood doesn't excuse him. His sexual compulsions don't excuse him. His marriages don't excuse him. He is responsible for the evil he unleashed. The killing began in 1982, though we may never know if there were earlier victims we simply haven't discovered. Gary targeted women society had pushed to the margins: prostitutes, teenage runaways, girls fleeing abusive homes who ended up on the streets with nowhere else to go. Many were indigenous women, or women of color, people whose disappearances didn't always generate headlines or massive search parties. They ranged in age from 14 to 38, each one a human being with dreams, with families, with lives that mattered. Gary saw them as disposable, as less than human, and he exploited their vulnerability with calculated precision. His method was horrifyingly simple. He would drive his pickup truck along the Pacific Highway south, that same road where he'd grown up, and approach women working the strip. He'd offer money, offer a ride, show them pictures of his young son to make himself seem safe, like a family man who couldn't possibly be dangerous. Once they got in his truck, he was in control. Sometimes he'd drive them to his house. Sometimes he'd park in a secluded area. Sometimes he'd take them deep into the woods. He'd have sex with them, and then, when they were most vulnerable, he'd strangle them. He used his hands, sometimes a ligature like a belt or their own clothing, applying pressure until their struggles stopped and their lives drained away. Gary preferred strangulation because it was quiet, because it didn't create blood spatter that could be traced, because it gave him the ultimate power over another person. He could watch the life leave their eyes. He could feel their bodies go limp in his grasp. And when it was over, when they were dead, he'd dispose of them like garbage. He'd dump bodies in clusters in the dense forests of King County, or along the banks of rivers, or sometimes he'd drive all the way to Oregon just to confuse investigators about where he was operating. He returned to the bodies later, sometimes multiple times, to engage in necrophilia. He justified this abhorrent behavior by saying it saved money because he didn't have to pay living prostitutes. He was organized, careful, and utterly devoid of empathy. The first 5 bodies were discovered in the Green River in July of 1982, floating in the cold water or tangled in the vegetation along the banks. Wendy Caulfield, just 16 years old, was found on July 15th. Marcia Chapman, 31, along with Cynthia Hines, 17, and Opal Mills, 16, were found on August 15th. By the end of summer, the body count was rising, and panic was spreading through the Seattle area. Women who worked the streets were terrified, but many had no choice but to continue. They needed money to survive, to feed children, to escape situations that were already desperate. And Gary Ridgway was hunting them. Between 1982 and 1984, more than 40 women vanished or were found dead. The Green River Task Force was formed by the King County Sheriff's Office, led by Detective Robert Keppel and Detective Dave Reichert, a man who would dedicate decades of his life to catching this killer. The task force grew to include more than 50 investigators, one of the largest operations of its kind in United States history. They were drowning in tips, in potential suspects, in frustration, because despite all their efforts, the killings continued. In 1984, in an act of desperation, investigators did something unprecedented. They consulted with Ted Bundy, another serial killer who had operated in the same region years earlier. Bundy was on death row in Florida, awaiting execution, but he agreed to help profile the Green River Killer. His insights were chillingly accurate. He suggested the killer was returning to the dump sites to relive his crimes, possibly engaging in necrophilia. He recommended investigators stake out fresh graves and watch for someone returning. Bundy understood the mind of a killer because he was one himself. His advice was valuable, but it wasn't enough to stop Ridgway. Gary had been on the task force's radar since 1982, when a witness reported seeing him with one of the victims. He was interviewed in 1983 and again in 1984. He took a polygraph test and passed it, which gave investigators false confidence that he wasn't their man. In 1987, he was arrested for soliciting an undercover police officer posing as a prostitute. During his booking, he provided samples of his saliva and hair. Investigators collected fibers from his truck and found distinctive microscopic spheres of spray paint, the kind used at the Kenworth factory where Gary worked. These tiny pieces of physical evidence were carefully preserved, waiting for technology to catch up to the crime. But the technology of the 1980s simply wasn't sophisticated enough to definitively link Gary to the murders. DNA testing existed, but it was in its infancy, expensive and imprecise. The fibers and paint spheres were circumstantial. Without a confession or a witness who could place him with a victim at the time of death, prosecutors didn't believe they had enough to convict him. So Gary Ridgway walked free, year after year after year, while women continued to die and families continued to grieve. The task force was eventually scaled back in the 1990s due to budget constraints and the lack of new leads. The case went cold, filed away with thousands of pages of reports, bags of evidence, and the haunting photographs of women who would never come home. But Dave Reichert never gave up. He became sheriff of King County, and he kept pushing for new technology to be applied to the old evidence. In 2001, advances in DNA testing, specifically PCR and STR analysis, finally gave investigators the tool they needed. Scientists retested the semen samples that had been collected from 3 victims' bodies decades earlier. The DNA matched Gary Ridgway. After nearly 20 years, they had him. On November 30th, 2001, detectives walked into the Kenworth factory where Gary was working. Just another ordinary day of painting trucks, and they placed him under arrest. He was initially charged with 4 counts of aggravated murder. More charges would follow as the evidence mounted. The investigation that had consumed so many lives, so many resources, so many years of frustration and heartbreak, was finally over. Gary Ridgway, the man who had hidden behind a mask of normalcy for decades, was in custody. But the story was far from finished, and the true horror of what he had done was only beginning to come to light. Welcome back, or if you're just joining us, thank you for being here to learn about this important case. Before we continue with Gary Ridgway's confession and the impact of his crimes, I want to hear from you again. Where are you watching from? Has this story affected you? If you're finding value in this deep dive into one of America's most disturbing criminal cases, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps share these stories and ensures that the victims are remembered with the respect they deserve. When Gary Ridgway was arrested in November of 2001, investigators faced a critical decision. They had DNA evidence linking him to several murders, but they didn't have bodies for most of the missing women. They didn't have all the answers that families desperately needed. So the King County Prosecutor's Office, led by Norm Malang, made a controversial choice. They would offer Ridgway a deal to avoid the death penalty in exchange for a full confession and his cooperation in locating remains. Many people were outraged. How could the state make a deal with a monster who had murdered dozens of women? But Malang understood something crucial. Without Ridgway's cooperation, many families would never have closure. Bodies would remain unfound, hidden in the vast forests of Washington state. The death penalty might have felt like justice, but it wouldn't answer the question that tormented so many. Where is she? In June of 2003, Gary Ridgway accepted the plea agreement. On November 5, 2003, he stood in court and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. On December 18, 2003, he was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 480 years for tampering with evidence. In 2011, a 49th murder charge was added when DNA evidence linked him to Rebecca Marrero, a 20-year-old woman who had disappeared in 1986. During his confessions, Gary Ridgway admitted to killing as many as 71 to 90 women, possibly more. He couldn't remember all their names. He couldn't remember all their faces. To him, they had been objects, not people. He described his crimes with disturbing calmness, explaining his methods without remorse. He took investigators on tours of dump sites, helping them locate remains that had been hidden for decades. In 2003, his guidance led to the discovery of remains belonging to Pammy Avent, Marie Malvar, and April Buttram. In 2005, the skull of Tracy Winston was found based on his directions. Listening to Gary Ridgway speak about his crimes is chilling. He showed no remorse, no real emotion except when discussing his third wife, Judith, whom he claimed to have genuinely loved. He talked about returning to the bodies to engage in necrophilia, justifying it by saying it satisfied his urges without requiring him to kill more women. He talked about his victims with utter contempt, calling them trash and claiming he was cleaning up the streets. Yet this same man had been a regular customer of these women for years. He chose them, he said, because they were easy to pick up and because no one would miss them. He was wrong about that. Every single one of those women was missed. Every single one mattered. The psychological profile of Gary Ridgway reveals a deeply disturbed individual, but it doesn't excuse his actions. Experts identified traits consistent with sexual sadism, necrophilia, and antisocial personality disorder. His toxic relationship with his mother created murderous rage toward women that he transferred onto his victims. His religious fanaticism coexisted with his compulsive sexual behavior and homicidal urges. He saw himself as morally superior, as someone doing society a favor. But here's what we need to understand. Millions of people have difficult childhoods. Millions of people struggle with psychological issues. The vast majority don't become serial killers. Gary Ridgway made choices. Every single day he chose to hunt. He chose to kill. He chose to desecrate bodies. He chose to let families suffer for years. Those were his choices, and he bears full responsibility for every single one of them. The victims themselves deserve more than just to be remembered as statistics. Wendy Caulfield was 16 years old, a runaway trying to survive. Marcia Chapman was 31, a mother who had fallen on hard times. Opal Mills was just 16. Cynthia Hines was 17. Rebecca Marrero was 20 when she vanished. In 2023, DNA technology finally identified Bone 17 as Lori Ann Razpotnik, who was only 15 when she died in 1982. For 41 years, her family didn't know what happened to her. There are still unidentified victims. Women Gary Ridgway killed whose names we don't know, whose families are still waiting for answers. He confessed to killing a woman he called Angie, who has never been identified. That's part of his legacy, too. The holes he left in communities, the missing pieces that can never be recovered. The case revolutionized forensic investigation in America. The successful use of DNA technology to solve cold cases inspired law enforcement agencies across the country to revisit unsolved murders. The case also highlighted the dangers faced by society's most vulnerable members and the tendency to deprioritize crimes against prostitutes, runaways, and other marginalized people. Many of Gary Ridgway's victims were indigenous women, reflecting a broader pattern of violence against Native American women that continues today. The Green River case helped bring attention to this issue, though progress has been slow. Recently, on social media, a Native American woman shared her story of escaping from Gary Ridgway decades ago. A harrowing reminder that for every victim we know about, there were likely others who got away and have lived with that trauma. Gary Ridgway is currently incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he has been since 2004. He's now 76 years old, spending 23 hours a day in his cell. He has no possibility of parole. He will die in prison, and that is exactly what he deserves. In September of 2024, he was temporarily moved to the King County Jail to assist investigators in locating more remains. That transfer didn't result in confirmed discoveries, but it shows law enforcement hasn't given up. The case remains open for unidentified victims. The Green River Killer case has been the subject of numerous documentaries, books, and films. These cultural artifacts serve an important purpose. They keep the memory of the victims alive. They educate new generations, and they remind us that evil can wear an ordinary face. Gary Ridgway's story teaches us critical lessons. First, evil often hides in plain sight. The most dangerous people aren't always the ones who stand out. They're often the quiet neighbors, the reliable co-workers, the churchgoers who seem normal. We need to be vigilant and trust our instincts. Second, society's most vulnerable members deserve protection and justice. For too long, crimes against prostitutes and runaways were deprioritized. That's wrong. Every human being deserves safety. Every missing person deserves a thorough investigation. Third, science and persistence can solve even the most complex cases. The Green River investigation spanned nearly 2 decades before DNA technology caught Gary Ridgway. Cold cases aren't hopeless. Justice can be slow, but it can also be inevitable. Finally, we must remember that behind every statistic, there's a human being. A person with dreams and fears, with people who loved them, with a future that was stolen. Gary Ridgway tried to reduce his victims to nothing. Our job is to refuse to let him succeed. We remember their names. We honor their memory. We insist that they mattered. The Green River Killer case is closed in the sense that the perpetrator is behind bars for life, but it remains open in our collective memory. Gary Ridgway's evil left scars that will never fully heal, but it also demonstrated the power of human determination, scientific advancement, and the refusal to let injustice stand. The women he killed deserve to be remembered not just as victims of a serial killer, but as individuals who lived, who mattered, and who are still loved. Thank you for staying with this difficult story to the end. These are not easy topics, but they're important. They remind us of the reality of evil and the ongoing need for vigilance, compassion, and justice. If this story has moved you, please share it, discuss it, and most importantly, remember the victims. That's the greatest honor we can give them.